And we are live. Welcome to the pod, Alexander Style. This man is the GM of America's Vinturas. I'm really hoping I'm saying that correctly. And so if I'm saying any of this correctly, I'm going to let you go ahead and jump in here and clarify. But your background quickly, you are originally from the United Kingdom, I believe. So went to Oxford, expanded finance, and then he worked at Swire Coca-Cola in China, which is apparently doing door-to-door sales, channel development. That sounds like such a hustle. And then you ended up starting like an EV company, which is super interesting because I actually also started an EV company when I was 20. Ours was not particularly successful, but I learned a lot. And then you worked in EV lease financing at a company called Fin, and went from 0 to 15 million in ARR in a year. And then now you are a GM at Vinturas doing global expansion. And I believe you guys are primarily in the automotive industry. So anyway, I'll let you kind of like clarify a little bit more about your background, but yeah, take it away. Like fill in the details, and specifically emphasizing how the heck you got into becoming such an expert on global trade.
Thank you, Andrew. No, it's great to be here. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I've sort of come from a pretty eclectic background. All of my family were in global trade. Both of my parents were born in India, and I was raised in Asia, partially South Africa, and in the US. But clearly, from my accent, always sent back to England for school. So I've sort of been all over the place. I studied Chinese at university, and my first job, as you mentioned, was working in the Coca-Cola system at Swire Coca-Cola. And I was a door-to-door Coca-Cola salesman in Xiamen in Fujian province in mainland China, which was intense. Of course, it takes you straight out of your sort of university bubble and puts you on the street, six days a week sales and daily targets. So that was pretty intense. I worked in the Coke system for about 6 years. And as you said, I also founded an EV company. We had to shutter those operations. Unfortunately, COVID was pretty brutal. And actually the Switch motorcycles, which was the OEM that we built out of that, is also, with rates higher, harder to raise capital. So yeah, I think a lot of people went into the EV space and learned a great deal. So that's awesome. Awesome to hear that you've been there as well. And yeah, I worked at Fin. That really was my first move into the automotive space, which was finished vehicles. How do we get these very expensive assets to and from customers, to and from manufacturers and dealerships in the most efficient way possible? So that was my first step into automotive. We built a really cool operation for Fin in the US. And then I joined Vinturas, and really what we do is the interoperability of data. So how do we connect the dots in logistics and supply chains globally to improve data flow and make sure that everyone has the information they need to work as efficiently as possible? So really, I'm going from Coke, EV, finished vehicle, and now I've sort of married all of that together. I've always been in supply chains or logistics chains in some way, shape, or form, and now really trying to marry them together and bring the data together with Vinturas.
Love that. There's so many interesting things in your background that if we this was a different context where we had more time, I would want to double click on. So we'll have to save that for drinks or dinner sometime. So I'm just gonna jump right into it. So if you have been living under a rock since January 1st of this year, and you're just like, hey, it's like, why are people talking about like trade wars and tariffs and like all this stuff? Like, could you give them like a speed run on what has changed in the world of like global trade in the last 3 months?
Absolutely. I mean, I think what we saw was really up until the election last year in November, no one was making any decisions because they didn't know what was coming. We saw post-November, there was a bit more like, okay, well, at least we know what we're getting. But the truth is, if you've been under a rock, we got a lot more than we thought we were going to get. Tariffs were always on the menu. This was something that the Trump administration first time round flirted with. But this time it's come in a lot harder. So what we're seeing is imbalance of trade, which in all honesty has definitely been the case with a lot of the US trading partners, has now been brought front and center as a topic. And this administration is going way more aggressive in addressing that than previous administrations. So what we've seen is, yeah, trade wars are starting, and how quickly can we mitigate that and prevent this being a runaway tit for tat? That's going to be a really big conversation going forward. But yeah, we're now stepping into territory that in someone of my age, I'm in my 30s, we've never seen this. This is protectionism starting again. This is a step back into an age before we even knew I guess we're the children of globalization, and this is a slightly worrying to many step backwards into a world that we didn't even know of.
Yeah, 100%. It's so I have a follow-up question to that, and I'm already going to be going off the agenda slightly, but I think you'll bear with me here. So goal here is not to make this super political, but really just to understand what is going on, not to make judgments about what is going on. And I have some empathy for, so there's a perspective in the US that's largely being espoused by the current administration that a lot of this is like negotiating tactics, but that generally there's an unfairness or an imbalance per se in global trade. And there's definitely something of an imbalance between like different countries, like are far greater exporters than others. But also there's a difference between that being an imbalance because different economies are different and there being an imbalance because things are actually unfair. And so I think in the US, largely like the Trump administration has a perspective and a lot of their supporters have a perspective that things have been unfair between the United States and many of its global trade partners, historically speaking, not just in an imbalance of trade flows, but specifically that some of these deals that have been cut are unfair. I am someone that feels relatively torn there because I'm like the most capitalist that exists. And I love the idea of free trade. Love the idea of globalism. In many ways, my business, helping companies deal with compliance obligations around the world is like very, very much like dependent upon this thing existing. And yet I also like grew up in Ohio in a very similar way to like our vice president JD Vance did. And I know how like wrecked the American Midwest has kind of been by this. And so I feel rather like torn. I don't really have an opinion of this. So I guess my question for you, being someone who knows way more about this than me, like what is your perspective on I guess, like, is there any validity to some of the perspective that things are unfair per se versus like, or is this, I'm just like, I'm mostly just curious if you have a perspective. Is this like, are there things that it could be deemed as unfair in some of these trade agreements? Generally, like, how do you perceive the different dynamics between each side as they posture against each other?
For sure. And I think that's a very good question. And it entirely comes down to perspective. I don't think there's a right and wrong answer. What we've seen, so I saw John Bolton speak at a TPM conference a couple of weeks ago, and, famously a hawk. But his opinion was that US projection of power, although the US taxpayer ultimately foots the bill and a lot of people get a free ride from his biggest point was Europe has got a free ride for decades on security. At the end of the day, the US projected its power not out of altruism, but really for its own benefit. That the US benefits from US projection of power more than anyone else. With Trump, what we're seeing is a retrenchment into pure economics, which is, I'm not looking at projection of power. The US has spent so much money projecting its power around the world, and as a result has cut deals where maybe they got a big benefit on the power projection side or a military base in that country, but as a result, they made a concession in a trade deal. So looking at the bigger picture, Trump is now looking at a purely economic picture. And yeah, some of these trade deals are unbalanced. As you said, sometimes it's a case of just in a globalized world, economies have different focuses and it comes out in the wash. But with this administration taking a purely economic look, and not taking into account, as I said, that US position as the world's policeman, yeah, you can definitely see how it looks unfair and that they see things that they want to rebalance. The big question is, at what cost? And at what cost to the US position as the leader of the free world?
Yeah. I think the point you seem to be making there is that there's the purely economics to economics comparison, but then there's historically the equation has not really just been that. There's economics, and then there's the more soft or not so soft power aspects of some of these agreements. And the current administration is like really refocused to caring less about those power dynamics and more about just purely like, what are the economics head to head?
Exactly. And like whichever lens you choose to look at it through, you can view something as fair or unfair, but it's going to be entirely subjective.
I think that's a really helpful framing because it does add color to it. This is it adds color to the different ways you could look at this, because I think that is one thing that's been confusing for me is everybody's point kind of sounds like it makes sense if you listen to them and just have an open mind.
Sure.
Yeah. So maybe moving into a little bit more to the weeds then here. I'm actually kind of curious about the differences in the import-export regimes in the United States versus other countries. My understanding, like, for example, something I have learned recently is that if you import something into the United Kingdom or somewhere in the EU or most countries around the world, they're going to collect that along with like duties and tariffs at the border. Whereas in the United States, we don't have a VAT system. We have sales tax. collect sales tax at the border. And so versus we do collect duties and tariffs. So that was an example I was not aware of previously that is like something of a difference. So what, in your view, what are the main differences functionally between these two different systems?
Well, a tariff is an import levy, right? So that's just an immediate fee that gets charged on. I mean, it can be done by weight. There's a few ways that you can skin that cat, but it's essentially an import duty that you have to pay on your goods. VAT is essentially the European or rest of the world equivalent, minus a few other countries, of sales tax, except for its value added tax. Generally, that tax gets charged and then rebated all the way up through the value chain up to the final consumer, who eventually foots that bill. But it drips all the way back down through the supply chain or through the value chain rather. So it taxes every time value is added to a good. In the US, you pretty much just pay flat sales tax, depending on what state you're in, at purchase, at consumption of that good. And that is then meant to make up for all of the value that's been created in the value chain up to there. Of course, there's instances where you get that double taxation, where you'll get the sales tax that on a good that is sold to someone who then makes it into something more valuable. So you're almost getting that double tax. But generally, again, that comes out in the wash because US sales taxes are so much lower than European value-added taxes. So,
So
depends how you look at it.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, please, go ahead.
I was gonna say, so I think that's like a great segue into the Trump administration has started to conflate that with almost being tariff-like, whereas historically people have not looked at it that way. Most like economists, tax experts would view that as trade neutral. It doesn't really incentivize trade one way or the other. And so, and also to your point, that there's something of a rate differential that tends to be higher in most countries than the average sales tax rate is. But then at the same time, you have some pyramiding at times that doesn't necessarily happen with the VAT regime. So I guess, is there any argument whatsoever that would make that being used in some kind of equation of trade differentials make sense? Or is it pretty much, is your perspective that it's a rather illogical argument?
So I think it's no different from a sales tax in the US being charged on, say, we come to my backyard vehicles. Someone buys a Land Rover in New Jersey, they're going to pay sales tax on that. You buy a Ford in Spain, you're going to pay VAT on it. The one thing that I can see impacting US exporters to, say, Europe is that VAT is often front-loaded. So you pay it when it enters the country. But a lot of countries, and this was really spearheaded by the Netherlands, have done VAT deferral. So it means that actually you don't, as an importer, have to pay your VAT as soon as it crosses the border. You can defer that to your regular filing of VAT. And particularly if you're coming into Europe, say, via the Netherlands, but your ultimate destination is to sell this car to someone in Poland, the VAT is going to be taken by the Polish government. The Dutch government really doesn't have much to take on that. So by deferring it, it means that you've now got a much clearer process and no one is cash out of hand. They'll always get it back eventually through a rebate, but no one's cash out of hand at that point. So I think the one point that would be contested when it comes to VAT is that when European exporters export to the US, they get a VAT rebate because they're getting rebated the money that's gone through the supply chain or the value chain as that asset has gained value up to the point where it was exported. But if you look at the US doesn't have that value added tax. So that asset is not taxed all the way up the value chain to export. All it is doing is a rebate. It's not actually it's not a subsidy. It's just giving tax break to the manufacturers who've already paid tax to get that asset to that point, when a US producer wouldn't have paid any tax up to that point. So really there are sort of minor impacts that can happen from it. And I can definitely see that it's the waters are muddy enough that you can make a point, but I think really it's a bargaining chip. And as a great negotiator, this is just another chip on the table and another stick over which to beat your opponent at the negotiating table. So I think it's certainly a pawn in this game, but I don't think it has a big impact.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I think the thing is I've tried to think about this is that it's an apples and oranges comparison. And so you can definitely make some points here and there on both sides, but it's that and sales tax actually do have enough differences, especially when you start factoring in not just the final consumption transactional level that most of us think of in the US, but also the import-export implications. And so it's pretty hard to make it just like a stack rank of this versus this. So on that point of bargaining chip, how much of the noise of what's happening, where it's like, at least my perspective is it seems like things are changing every day and things like 1 minute we're going to do this and actually just kidding, we're not going to do that. How much of the noise right now do you think is just this bargaining that's happening between nation states versus actual potential like global world order shifts and how trade functions?
I mean, it's a big game of chicken. And it was fascinating at TPM, which is the sort of number one container freight conference in the world, because we saw speakers come onto stage and they said, we're going to have to just skip the first 3 slides because there was a post on Truth Social last night, which has completely changed the narrative. So it was just the slides prepared the night before were not relevant the next day. That's how quickly things are shifting. I think that it's certainly a game of making the rest of the world realize how the US has been footing the bill for such a long time. I think that's something that the Trump administration, and I don't think unfairly, is doing. The risk is that if the opposition on that table are not willing to back down or not willing to say, oh no, we will just take this, you get runaway tit for tat and you get that sort of protectionism. I mean, I'm hoping that what we see is there's an earnest recognition that nobody benefits from that situation, and that on both sides they recognize that this isn't a zero-sum game. We might as well come to an agreement, but at the moment it's a fair amount of posturing. We'll just have to see what happens. But I'm certainly hopeful that we can see a global consensus start to form, and maybe one where the US doesn't project its power in the same way as it used to. Again, whether you view that as good or bad is very subjective, but certainly one where the US is paying a lot more attention to individual trade interactions with different nation states and saying, you know, is this balanced or not? Do we have a balanced import-export?
Yeah. Yeah, and by the way, I think you're doing a great job with these. Like, I'm throwing questions at you that are like such hard questions to answer, and you're giving very, very thoughtful, reflective answers as we go. And so, on that point, I think the mentioned earlier some of this stuff being like it is like a bit of a rebalancing. I think one thing that has surprised me is who is actually doing the fighting. I think most people, my first business got somewhat impacted by the first trade war when Trump was in office the first time around. And a lot of that was centered around China. There was obviously some spatting with like Mexico and Canada and other trade partners, but most of it was focused on China. This time around, I have been surprised to the degree to which it's been focused on from a US perspective, our closest geographically neighboring countries. Do you have a perspective on why it's actually been so focused on Canada, especially?
Canada really took me by surprise as well. I think that I certainly didn't see it coming. There didn't seem to be a terribly large unbalance there. I think there was certainly border disputes, and I think this has been used as a tool for negotiating better control of the border from the Canadian side. That's what I understood. But yeah, I didn't really understand from the Canadian side quite why that was such a big focus. Mexico, you've certainly got a lot of fentanyl coming across and a huge number of illegal immigrants. So those are both massive focuses, and a big part of the mandate that the Trump administration was given by the people of the USA was, we want the illegal migration at the border to be sorted. It was just so crazy about the proportion of voters who wanted that. And also, let's figure out fentanyl. So I think that using that as a way of getting Mexico to come to the table on border security was another key focus there. It's funny because after the Biden administration really encouraged so many countries not just to insource all of their supply chains to the US, but also to friendshore. So move supply chains out of China, but to Mexico, to Canada, to countries that were, close allies. It's now a lot of companies that had ended up doing that and have now found themselves in a position where they've moved a whole plant to Mexico, but are now getting tariffs on them just as they would if they'd left it in China, for example. So I think we definitely need to be careful around this, because a lot of that friendshoring did make strategic sense, but you're going to if you then start pushing away those friends that you encourage the friendshoring to.
Yeah. So on that point, actually, we've kind of talked about around some of the effects. So what is your sense, especially having just been at this conference, working in this industry? What's your sense of the, I guess, industries affected by this? Like, what's the tone? Like, you go to this conference, people are obviously talking about this. Is the tone one of uncertainty? Is the tone one of like WTF is going on here? Like, well, what's generally like the sense that you talk to folks in industry that whose businesses are affected by all these changes?
Well, the great thing about logistics and supply chain is that everyone in the industry has battle wounds that they could tell you about. It's the industry that just gets battered the whole time. There's always something going wrong. If it isn't a volcano that's brought all the air freight down, it's at the Panama Canal going dry, or it's the Suez being blocked, or there's always something. And so in supply chain and logistics, you've got an incredibly sense of resolve. So I don't think that what we didn't see was desperation. We didn't see people saying, oh my God, what are we going to do? It was just, oh, I guess there's another day in the office. Let's just figure this out. Certainly uncertainty because things change so quickly. But one of the sort of one of the core leaders, I would say, Soren Toft, up on stage said, guys, let's just zoom out for a second from focus on what we're hearing from North America. And let's look at this, in logistics and particularly container freight is a global market, and we're set to hit 6% growth this year. And that's a global 6% growth. So yes, we've got the US, and the US is a massive part of that. But this is a growing industry, and we can navigate these challenges, and we always have. It was sort of optimism, belief in each other, but also, of course, a fair dollop of uncertainty because just no one knows what's going to happen next.
Yeah. Which industries have been affected the most by this so far? Like, I know you're in the automotive industry, and it seems like steel and the automotive tariffs have been brought up, at least in some of at least the posturing by the United States.
I mean, a lot of things have. Automotive, maybe I'm biased, but I think automotive is also just it's a funny combination because it's such a high value asset, but it's almost a consumer good at the same time because it's so in such high demand and sold in such high volumes. But the supply chains are so integrated across nations. So you'll have steel from the USA going across to a plant in Canada to be formed into quarter panel. I'm making this up, but this is completely real in other ways. Like, I'm sure they're exact correct examples. But then that quarter panel goes down to Mexico to get formed into a vehicle that then gets sent to a dealership in the United States. And that we're just talking there about one piece of a vehicle. When you look at all of the parts that come into it, you've got a completely global supply chain. And so if you're doing these tariffs at each time something crosses a border, the value of a vehicle or the cost of a vehicle is just going to go through the roof. So what we've seen is the Trump administration making exceptions for automotive, which is good, I think, particularly when it comes to steel, aluminium, auto parts. But yeah, I think in a world that has become really, truly globalized, it's very hard to start to unpick all of these things without losing a lot of value, I guess.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's like shocking. There's a stat or an infographic that went viral, I want to say might have been even 5 to 10 years ago, of just all the different things involved in making an iPhone around the world and like all the different places that the parts come from. And it's kind of shocking. And if you start, and it's not just even that the parts are all sourced from this place and then all come to California. It's like they like might move across borders multiple times. So to your point, and especially in the auto industry, where like the parts are also quite expensive on a per unit basis, that can quickly add up to a large amount of fees. And then that likely getting into maybe my next question: who loses the most from some of this stuff? Is it the consumer? Is it specific industry? Is like who are kind of the losers, at least as things are currently shifting?
I mean, when it comes to tariffs, it's inevitably the consumer that ends up paying because no one else is going to pick up that tab. That is initially what the Trump administration are looking at, is bringing more jobs back to America, bringing more, the idea being that if a car is manufactured within the USA or whatever is manufactured within the USA, then you don't pay any tariffs. So there's an end game to really bring back jobs to a lot of middle America who lost so much during the the sort of massive sprint towards globalization that we saw under successive administrations. Of course, initially, the consumer, most countries in Europe, a car is something that some people need, but not everyone. In America, you really have to have a car. And so when it comes to the US consumer, if the prices of cars are going up, that's a direct impact because it's something that everyone needs in order to do their job outside, of course, key core metro areas. So yeah, I think ultimately the consumers globally will pick up the tab for these tariffs. The question is, does it have the intended effect of bringing jobs back to America for the US? That's purely from a US perspective. Being a Brit, will this bring jobs back into the UK for manufacturing? I just don't know. I think that we're probably too small a player to see a huge shift that way. But the whole idea of globalization was we specialize across borders. So seeing a move away from that is, will definitely have an impact. And as I said, the consumer will pay, at least for now.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, you're gonna see it drop on prices to some degree. You could argue that we already have. Yeah, I think it is. Also, I think that one thing that's just unclear to me is that supply chains don't move quickly. Like it's very hard to ship these things overnight. And so even if there is like theoretically a job impact, it's unlikely to see these things, the benefits, the supposed benefits happen quickly. So you brought this up earlier, but do you think we are now entering an era of protectionism for the first time in, I think, arguably centuries?
Yes and no. I don't know if it'll be protectionism. I think, and this is a topic that I've discussed many times with good friends, one Rob Cobbold in particular, and really it comes down to what does the history of humanity look like? And it is argued that we tend towards collaboration and that we see ebbs and we see flows, but each time the wave comes in a little bit further than it goes back. So what we saw particularly under Obama, was this sprint towards globalization. And it was like, right, we're just all of these jobs can go offshore because they can do it cheaper. But then, of course, there was the reaction back at home, which was, what do people do if they've lost all their jobs and you can't replace them with anything? So there was just that. I think what we're seeing is a very natural swing back of the pendulum, a retrenchment back into, wait, let's pump the brakes a little bit on this because we can't just offshore all of these American jobs and then have no plan to mitigate for that. Trying to bring jobs back again. And then I think we'll just see another swing forward into globalization in the future. We'll certainly see, of course, these trends take decades at least. So we're probably in for a couple of decades of, backing off the gas pedal and taking a few steps back towards, well, actually, what was the impact of globalization? And maybe we need to undo a little bit of that before we start going further down that road.
Yeah. So I guess from that lens, you seem to think that perhaps this will last even beyond this current American presidential administration. You think that these effects will continue to be sorted for decades to come?
I think once these processes have started and international diplomacy has gone on that route, it's like a train that starts moving. It starts moving very slowly and it's easy to stop. But the longer it's allowed to run, and 4 years is a fair amount of time, it's very hard to then just get a new administration and then suddenly say, do you know what, guys, scratch all of that. We're going to go back to how we were before, because you've now got to unpick everything that's happened in the intervening period, not only between you in that bilateral agreement, but in that bilateral agreement, you probably changed agreements for that trading partner with a whole load of their trading partners. So there's knock-on effect. It's not just the US versus the world. This is something that we're seeing globally. And I think also that the mandate that was won by Donald Trump was quite clearly on the back of listening to the average voter. And I think that what we saw was the real beneficiaries of globalization were on the coasts and in largely blue areas. And a lot of people who had lost from that were in the middle of America and in the red areas. And that's really where this election was won. It was saying, we're going to bring jobs back to America. And I don't think those voters are going anywhere. And I don't think this is just a Trump. I think this is that there are larger forces at play here, and I don't see them going away for a while. So my opinion is that regardless of whether you see benefit or not, We're probably in for a couple of decades of this before we see that the balance start to shift again back in favor of globalization. But that's just my opinion, and what do I know?
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's fair, and I think it's the thing a lot of us are asking right now. I guess then from that point of view, how do you think, if you were advising someone who's like an entrepreneur, there's just someone who's like working in either just more generally, like we're all affected by the economy, but if you're like building businesses, operating businesses, trying to figure out how to advise even your own clients throughout this process, like what would you be thinking about to stay maybe anti-fragile over the years to come?
Well, and this is squarely relevant to what I'm doing in my job now at Vinturas, which is resilience and building resilience into supply chain, which is that you can't keep all your eggs in one basket. You can't just have one supplier for each thing, each object, each ingredient in whatever it is that you're putting together. And you've really got to make sure that goes for not just materials, but also for logistic service providers. I can't get this across. If I can't get this through the Suez Canal, how can I get this around in another way? So always making sure that you're well set up and that you have this ecosystem built of providers and trading partners that you can lean on. Essentially, you've built resiliency into your own supply chain. What we do in order to do that is we connect all the data points. So instead of having to do everything manually by phone and email, you can now orchestrate changes and shifts in your supply chain with mouse clicks. What we saw was the sort of Pareto principle of 80% of your supply chain ran smoothly and 20% went wrong has now been completely flipped on its head. And we saw this, we see this with all of our clients. Now you're lucky if 20% of your supply chain is running smoothly and 80% is the exception. Yeah, I would say whatever it is you're doing, if it's international, build resilience in and make sure that you've got plan B and plan C, because we're in uncertain times and we just don't know what's around the corner, and it's better to be prepared than not prepared at that.
Yeah, well said. So it's almost it's actually something that came to mind there is I guess if you're in if things do retrench a bit, is where there are opportunities. Like we've talked a lot about, this is obviously like just how to survive or not be knocked out per se by a lot of these changes, but there's also, whenever there's chaos, there's usually opportunity somewhere. And so are there areas where with like these new paradigm shifts where you think this could be an interesting opportunity for certain entrepreneurs, certain businesses, certain industries?
I mean, I'm very biased in the sense that I sort of programmed at the moment to look at everything through the lens of logistics and supply chains. So I would say that, as you said, with this sort of disruption comes a lot of opportunity. I think everyone has become very set in their ways, and we got very used to a sort of not quite full free trade, but a free trade light world where you could pretty much ship things wherever you needed them to get, and there wasn't a huge barrier to entry. I think that what we're seeing now is more and more barriers. And so if you're in a position to build now, even if it's software or even if it's just a service that help navigate those, you're going to be in very high demand, because everyone, the second something goes wrong, is going to come to your door and say, oh, you're a specialist in this. I really need to fix this. When they're desperate, they'll move fast. We found that the incubation period for or the sales cycle can be quite slow in some industries, but when people need you, they need you now, and you can accelerate that really quickly. So I think we're going to see a lot of opportunity for new people to come into the market.
Us is a ladder. Well, sir, you've been super helpful today. This is super interesting. I think I certainly learned a lot, and I think other folks will too. Where can people find you, reach out, engage with you, learn more about working with you, all that good stuff?
For sure, yeah. Alexander Style on LinkedIn is probably the easiest way, or alexander.style@vinturas.com. Feel free to ping me an email. I'm always happy to chat about anything and everything. So, yeah, and thank you, Andrew. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I really, really enjoyed this.
Thank you for coming on, and that was fun. We'll put your LinkedIn in the notes, and thank you for joining us today.